Good morning, everyone. I hope you are all well. Welcome to today's first webinar session of the Stantec Southwest Series CPD events, which we are providing a platform for sharing knowledge and ideas on all sorts of infrastructure and development topics in the Southwest region. It's fantastic to have so many people join us on the call today. There's a really good number of us, I can see, and there's a good mix of familiar faces as well as some new faces too, so that's really good. Now, for anyone that doesn't already know me, my name is Craig Mason. I'm an Associate Transport Planner at Stantec, and I'm based within our Taunton office. I'm pleased to say that I have the pleasure of hosting this morning's session for you, and we are joined by some of our friends from Stride Treglown Architects. We have a total of 6 presentations for you today, each being around sort of 5 or 6 minutes in length. These will be given by Paul Seaver, Clive Tanner, Sarah Jenkinson, Lauren Cook, Robert Delius and Isabel Carter. They will each share their own thoughts on good street design by drawing upon their own experiences, examples and professional backgrounds. So thanks to all of them for giving up their time to join us for today's session. Now, before we get started, I thought it would be good to briefly explain why we've decided to start with the topic of good streets. Well, quite simply, streets are a crucial aspect of the places in which we all live and our communities are built around, and everybody has an opinion on how they should be designed. Some would argue that we often take them for granted and that this has seen us simplify and organise streets through segregation, which is resulting in too many streets being designed for traffic movement alone. Others, including myself, would say that streets in fact play a wider role in creating successful places. More than ever, streets need to respond to the complexities of public life, promoting the interaction of people with different priorities, different needs and different expectations. This emphasises that a multidisciplinary approach, whilst promoting innovation and flexibility, and the need for a better balance between pedestrian and vehicle movement is required. And finally, I think we'll all be in agreement that the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted our everyday lives, everything from how we work, study, shop, socialise and play. As we continue moving through recovery, it will be interesting to see which of these changes will revert to how they were before, and which trends will persist and shape a different future for our built environment. On that note, I'll now hand over to our presenters who will spend the next 30-35 minutes or so providing their own thoughts on some of these issues. Following the presentations, we will have an opportunity for a Q&A session where we very much hope that some of you will engage with us on the issues covered. Please don't be shy. These sessions are so much better if the panel have some questions to answer. So please do submit your questions in the chat box as we go through, and we will try to cover as many questions as we can at the end. So I think that's it from me for now. So I will hand over to Paul Seaver in the first instance to kick things off. So thank you, Paul.
Lovely. Thanks, Craig. Just a quick introduction to our team talking to you today. We all have very different backgrounds at Stride Treglown, but our passion for good placemaking has brought us together to form Stride Treglown's place team. So Sarah and I lead the urban design studio, while Isabel is the head of landscape design. Rob is an architect who's also our head of sustainability. Clive is head of graphic design, and Lauren heads up the planning side of our place team. And together today, we're going to be giving you some personal reflections on good streets, which we hope you'll find interesting. Right, next, and next again. So streets are one of the great levelers of our society. They have the potential to serve everyone in society, irrespective of ethnicity, of wealth, of health. And the street is one of the strongest symbols of an equal and balanced society. Next. And yet in so many streets, we've allowed the proliferation of private vehicles to take over, with the result that we've created a 2-tier street society where those in vehicles are given priority status, while those without are literally relegated to the edges of that street society. And even after pavement widening projects where we still end up with private vehicles still being given priority, as you can see here, where the bulk of activity is around the edges, and yet most of the central part of the street is for vehicles. But this issue isn't confined to the big cities. It can sometimes be worse in smaller historic market towns. So here in Marlborough, where the main street is, it's typically about 30 metres wide, pedestrians just have a few metres of pavement either side. And it's not just about private cars. The nature of transport has changed greatly over the past century, resulting in a broader range of issues. We're all well aware of these impacts. So we've got congestion, we've got noise, air pollution, respiratory problems, obesity, personal safety, and yet we continue to give vehicles priority. And why? In short, we're addicted to convenience the private vehicles give us as individuals, even though we all know it's to the detriment of the well-being of the communities who use the streets day in and day out. But the potential for our towns and villages is huge. There's so much fun and happiness and healthiness to be found if we could find a way of scaling back the dominance of vehicles on our streets and give them back to people to enjoy. Next, there are measures being rolled out to address aspects of this issue, but the problem is that none of them on their own will help to create or reinforce an equal and equitable street society, or in a timescale that's realistic. The reality is that we need to think more holistically and strategically to have the desired effects. And really, we should be aiming to replace car parks with parks for people and nature. This isn't a new idea. Before anybody raises their hand, there are lots of examples of individual streets where parking has been removed in one go and where people have embraced the change. This street here is close to our Bristol office, where the pedestrianisation of the street has enabled the surrounding businesses to bleed out into the street and to really bring it to life with colour and activity and noise. But it's not always universally welcomed. This protest was by the local traders in Clifton against the council's plan to introduce a residence parking scheme around the city. But 7 years on, the tank is long gone, and everyone now accepts that parking isn't as straightforward as it once was. However, what has made much more of a noticeable difference is what's happened as a result of the pandemic. All the eateries have had the on-street parking spaces outside their properties made available to them for outdoor seating areas. And really, pandemic or no pandemic, these are the sorts of streets and environments that we should be aspiring to create. And it's been demonstrated now that it's both possible and desirable to do so. So what should that strategy for delivering this be? My feeling, well, should we be concentrating on bigger interventions in a smaller number of areas? But then back to my earlier observation, is that really an equitable solution? A more gradual approach that reaches out to everyone in a town or city seems to make more sense, replacing on average something like every 10th on-street parking space every year with life would have an enormous effect on our urban environments in terms of congestion and space and personal safety, as well as helping to create a more vibrant street identity. Now, I'm based in the Bristol area, and I've been looking into the amount of on-street car parking across the city, and the city has over 25,000 on-street parking spaces, not including park and ride or multi-story or anything like that. And that's the equivalent of about 29 hectares of land of just parking side by side, end to end. It's a phenomenal amount. And if you were to place all of these on-street parking spaces end to end, would give a strip of land over 120 kilometres long, which is broadly the distance between our Bristol and Birmingham offices. And that is all just for that's dedicated to the storage of private property. It seems absurd. So, but to put that into context, then the world famous High Line linear park that so successfully snakes through southern Manhattan is just 3 hectares in area, albeit elevated over the existing streets. So, if the Southwest's political target was to gradually reduce or eliminate our on-street parking provision over a decade or so, just think what we could achieve. Okay, that's me. Over to Rob next.
Thanks, Paul. So, don't create streets. I appreciate this is a fairly provocatively titled talk for an event about street design. But what I'm saying is, when you hear the term streets, one is basically thinking of a space, a thoroughfare, really, for vehicles and people, and critically, it's really less of a place, but more of a thoroughfare. So in my talk, I'm going to be talking to you more about lanes, mews, kind of spaces, gardens and courtyard. So this picture here, I mean, this could be anywhere really in the UK. It's pretty typical of many modern developments. You've got cars parked in front of houses. The landscape, very sadly, is sort of a bit of a leftover thought in this particular street. It's basically a sea of tarmac, and it's definitely a thoroughfare for cars more than a space for people. Next, please. So it wasn't always like this. And achieving high density and a sense of community is always so much easier when you don't have to design for vehicles. admittedly, you'd be pretty pressed to get a vehicle up this slope in Italy, but it has a real sense of human scale, I think you'd agree. And you know, like in the picture here, it creates real natural places to stop and have a chat. Next slide, please. Another shot from a town in Italy, and yes, I will be sharing a few of my holiday snaps, but hopefully no one really minds that during lockdown. We can kind of pretend we're somewhere else for a few minutes. So these are the sort of places that we love seeking out when we're on holiday, but why can't we actually do this sort of thing when we're in the UK? And you know, from this picture, you'll looking at it, there's a beautiful texture on the ground, there's texture on the walls, there's balconies, there's planting. It's a really nice space. Next, please. So when we design places like this, they're really places for walking, and it makes them a much safer place. And we can, like in this picture, start to populate them with plants, and residents can take ownership of them, and that's really important. And this is another example of a really amazing texture. Next slide, please. Now, I know someone's going to be saying, well, all those photographs you've just been showing, they're very much kind of Southern European examples. They're tight lanes because of climatic reasons for creating shade, but it's not always the case. So this is a picture from Alsace in northern France, and you do find these much smaller spaces in the old historic towns of Central and Northern Europe as well, which have that human scale. Next, please. But it's also not just on the continent. So this is a picture from Rye in Kent, and it's pretty typical of many of our older towns which have these narrower streets. Yes, it is a little bit wider than the previous examples, but that's probably because in the UK we're starting to try and kind of introduce the sun, get more light in, and it's probably a route for vehicles as well, but it's very much feels like a walking route. Next, please. And closer to home for me, this is a place, Marshfield, just north of Bath. And this is a space for vehicles, but it's also very much a space for people as well. It feels like a people space. And for me, I love the fact that there's a bench right outside the house. And I love that the owners of that house will be sitting in essentially what is their front garden. So that's something we really don't do very much in the UK, and it'd be fantastic if we could do more of it. And you'll obviously see the building to building width on that previous one. It's probably about 6 meters. It's not very far apart, but I think it feels comfortable. Next slide, please. And this is in my hometown of Bath. Again, it's quite a narrow street. It does have as you can see, a bit of a parking problem. There are cars up on the pavement, but I think it's still a great space. You'd still enjoy walking through it, and you probably wouldn't walk on the pavement. You would walk on the road. It feels safe, and it feels like a nice space to be. Next slide, please. So how do we actually emulate all of these great examples in modern developments today? So this is Totnes. This is a project that we've done, Baltic Wharf. In the top left-hand part of the slide, you can see a sketch how we've explored the really beautiful historic narrow lanes of Totnes, and the bottom left-hand sketch looking at how we can incorporate those into the development. And the photo on the right is sort of popping out of that narrow lane and into a much bigger space. Next, please. And in that bigger space as well, it's thinking about creating the space for residents to get together, get to know each other, and creating that real sense of community, which is really hard when you've got a space which is dominated by parking. Next, please. And then another part of the same development, we've created a space which is not about two parallel rows of housing, but it's very much a space. It's the housing narrows at one end. It feels neighbourly, it feels safe, it feels welcoming, and it has a great sense of place. Next, please. And in Bristol, we've done something similar, which is for Bristol Community Land Trust in Fish Ponds, where residents didn't want to have parking dominating their development. So the parking was relocated just outside out of the sketch to the right hand side, and instead you've got a garden in the centre of the development, and it has that great neighbourly feel. All the residents, know each other very well, and this is something that we can be doing more of. Next, please. In our scheme in Langport in Somerset a few years ago, again, putting a garden right in the middle of the project, and we do have garages in this site, but they're well integrated up in the right hand side. You can see into the architecture of the buildings. The parking is tucked between the two buildings, completely out of sight. It feels like a really nice space with the planting in the middle. Next slide, please. And that notion of kind of the garden, and this is what we were really trying to explore in Paintworks, which many of you might be familiar with, where we've actually raised the whole development up above the parking, which creates this complete network of garden streets. And a bit like the shot of Marshfield a few slides back, this is probably only 6 meters apart, and this is the kind of scale of space you can achieve when you don't have to design in cars. Next slide, please. So my final slide, this is a competition entry we did for the Reimagining the Garden City, where we've created a whole development of garden spaces, homes around gardens, and the parking in some cases is located outside of them, and in some cases it's completely integrated so that you don't see it. So hopefully I've managed to show you some examples where the car hasn't always come first, where streets in the conventional sense don't always have to be the answer, and where lanes, spaces, courtyards, gardens are so much better for safety, for people and for community. Thank you.
So following on from Paul and Rob, I'm going to talk about more how we think about how we can change the existing streets we have rather than perhaps designing the new. Next slide. So why do streets matter? Paul and Rob have already touched on this, but in recent studies, admittedly this is for American cities, 50 to 60% of our city centre land use is generally taken up by roads, pavements and parking. And this is a lot of public land that is focused on private vehicles, especially when we know that quality open green space is in such great need. So despite being a key component of our public realm, we prioritise cars in these spaces rather than all the other users, and certainly more vulnerable users, and those really actually quite dependent on our public realm. Parked cars, for example, we know are parked on an average for 96.5% of their lifetime. So this private use just congests our public space. And more and more we see moving cars just dominating the moving spaces too. But how do we make it safe and inviting for pedestrians, cyclists and all other non-traffic car users? Next slide. Well, the lockdown has certainly been tough for all of us, particularly in these winter months. But, I think a few of us saw something exciting starting to happen, particularly in the summer months. And that was when we realised how dependent we were becoming on the public realm that was local to the places we were living in. And I think people started gaining a lot more confidence in using it in a way that they wanted to, and that was a bit more fun. Next slide. So what if that became the norm, at least on a temporary basis? We know that shifting, previous slide, we know that shifting cultural attitude takes a generation. It's not an overnight change. So, and we also know that changes in existing street design cost a lot, and funding is certainly not something that's on our side at the moment. But with more home working, time and flexibility really is on our side. Next slide, please. So let's look abroad. Let's look at what's happening in other countries, in other continents. This is Ciclovia in Colombia, and this is something that's been going on since 1974. And every Sunday and bank holiday, 75 miles of roads in the centre of the city in Bogota are closed. And they're closed to all motorised vehicles and open for cyclists, skaters, runners, walkers, families, everyone not in a vehicle. And this all started by young activists who were keen to try and take over the streets, and it was supported by the government when they realised how much this could improve air quality and the physical environment. And even today, we see there that there's a total participation in Bogota alone of 1.5 million people on every single event. And that's 20% of Bogota's population. Next slide. This is a map. It's become such a sort of key public event and regular part of their calendar that it's mapped so that tourist visitors can all be part of this event too. And you can see that this just stretches for into different quarters, different parts of the city so that everyone can be involved. Next slide. And what are the outcomes? Well, there's the obvious stuff. It creates space for physical activity, healthy habits, it reduces obesity, reduces greenhouse gases. But the thing that's really in the headlines at the moment, which I think is a really interesting point, is that it alleviates social inequality. This is something that is free and accessible for everyone. It's not about a status symbol, and also it doesn't cost anything. It's really, really low input of initial cost to make this happen for the actual cost benefit that comes out of making it happen. And because this has been so successful, this is starting to be seen in other countries. So Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Chile, and elsewhere in Latin America are starting to take on Bike Sundays, and even parts of North America. Next slide. So what could this look like for us if we started to think about this in Europe or in the UK or in the Southwest? How could we be converting our streets on these temporary bases for places for play, getting out there to do yoga and cycling and meeting our friends when we can after lockdown in open spaces? Next slide. Play streets. This is also something that is not new. So back in 2009, this was started in Bristol. 2 residents sought permission using the street party procedure to close their street one day after school for their children to free play. And after the success of this one session, they then supported neighbouring residents for this to happen for 6 nearby streets in 2010. And then this became quite a regular basis, happening every week. So this gained political support from the cabinet, and then highways officers developed a trial temporary play street order for a couple of years, which basically allowed residents to have the same uses that previously were part of the street party procedure. And soon it enabled residents to make one single application every year to be able to close their streets once a week for up to 3 hours. And this is now happening on about 100 streets around the city. Next slide. So the real focus for talking about temporary measures is by starting with these temporary interventions, we can start to get a feel for how more permanent solutions might be in a low cost, low commitment way. And it can be from small interventions in residential streets, like we can see here, more permanent play features or more permanent cycle connections, through to, next slide, through to whole urban blocks like we're seeing here in Barcelona. This is the super blocks intervention, where they've actually closed sort of several streets that are in the middle of sort of a wider block to give them over to the use of play and meeting. Next slide. And ultimately, the aim here is really to move towards a street user hierarchy that puts the most vulnerable and local users at the top. And how can we really help everyone to shift towards this perspective? Next slide. So I'm a big believer in not just what, but how, and here's some thoughts on how we can think about moving towards that. So individually, we need to all be connecting with our neighbours more and spending time with them on the streets that join and physically link us, and use our imagination about how we can use that space confidently. Locally, we need to campaign, of course, for more control of our streets and really push for that to get part of local policy too. And of course, professionally, we need to be advocating streets and designs that really challenge the norm and really putting energy into those conversations with highways departments to make change. Next slide. And just finishing here with a quote from Jane Jacobs. It's a reminder, it will take all of us. Cities have the capability of providing something for everyone only because and only when they are created by everybody. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over.
Clive, are you there? think you might be on mute.
Should we progress to Izzy and then move back to Clive? We can reconnect.
Yes, I think let's do that.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I might just have to jump through these slides quickly. Sorry, hold on.
Clive has just said he can't unmute, so.
Just going to jump through. Apologies. Okay, whoop, here we go. So, can you see connecting with nature slide?
Yes, off you
Great,
go.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about how we can, using our streets, we can connect with nature. And in terms of access to nature and natural environments, it's well documented that there's a positive impact on health and well-being, and sort of experiencing nature gives us this immersive joy of being in contact with the natural world and allows us to explore and play and learn and wonder. And there's been a renewed opportunity, really, particularly in the pandemic and the lockdown, where we're able to observe and experience nature in our cities. So I'm going to talk about how we can encourage that and really connect with nature. So when we're talking or thinking about our first experience of nature, it's commonly sort of exploring natural environments on a large scale with sort of views and mountains and forests or meadows and sort of observing nature. But there's also the playful interaction with natural elements, so climbing a tree or walking through puddles and looking at beetles and butterflies. It's all part of that connection. And so in terms of how we can bring that into our cities, particularly urban woods and trees provide a vital habitat for urban wildlife, and are just as important, if not more so, in connecting with nature in an urban environment. So when looking at street trees, they contribute to the wider green infrastructure and create corridors for wildlife to enter our towns and cities, and they reduce air and noise pollution to help with urban cooling. They support a huge number of flora and fauna, bringing us closer to nature, or bringing us the opportunity to be closer to nature. And they also give us a seasonal reference, and they have a calming effect on our nervous system, so supporting our well-being. It's also recognised that street trees add value to neighbourhoods. However, they have been under threat in recent years. I don't know if you remember the Sheffield Their Streets Ahead programme, which is the namesake of this talk, but a very different approach, where a mass felling of over 5,000 street trees was done on the basis of maintenance, and it caused public outcry among residents. So while there may be a lack of appreciation and blamed on budgets and neglect or whatever, there's still the hope that people really care about street trees and they're important to their daily life. Luckily, there's organisations like the Woodland Trust who support communities to fight for street trees and can offer resources for that. So just thinking of other ways to connect with nature in our streets, as my colleagues have mentioned previously, if we slow down and reduce the limit the vehicular movement on our streets, it allows people to use their streets and notice things on a pedestrian experience. So this could be done, using paving materials to change the priority and to erase the road from our streets. So it's about the people and the wildlife and the place rather than the cars. So to create spaces and places rather than, providing an opportunity for people to rest and explore their streets rather than just consider them as a route to somewhere. Another thing that's been touched on by my colleagues is this taking of ownership. So considering streets as gardens for growing, and this also encourages wildlife and community bonding. And using a variety of plants and habitats to encourage wildlife for us to connect with. So the more biodiverse planting we can get into our streets, the more we will come into daily contact with wildlife and reconnect with nature. In terms of some examples here of those things I've just mentioned, so we've got, the kind of obvious Exhibition Road, where a simple, bold change to the paving on the streets changes the perception completely from a road to a place. And similarly, looking at introducing seating opportunities that are next to high quality green infrastructure spaces. It gives you the opportunity to dwell in a space more, and it makes it a more comfortable environment. And just being creative. So for Sheffield University, they've doubled the seating up with the planters so that you can maybe use that as a desk as well. And all the while introducing green infrastructure as part of the street scene. In terms of sort of more community spaces, you can either do this as interventions on existing streets, so sort of community clubs grouping together to do some simple interventions to introduce some planting and gardening into the streets, or by incorporating them as part of the design initially. So for Houndwood in streets, there's a home zone approach effectively to those residential neighbourhoods, and there's the communal spaces for growing and encouraging participation, but also by including sort of biodiverse planting. Again, like I said, like at the Meadow Elephant Park as a really beautiful example, it will bring nature into your streets. And in terms of nature within our cities and towns, it is actually all around us, and there are simple things we can do to encourage it to flourish. So by just putting up a bird feeder or a bird bath, but also from lockdown, there was a sort of people had noticed that some animals had started coming into our towns more because there was no one around, there was no cars driving about, and they felt braver to come and visit our streets. It also is as an opportunity for creating public art. We can combine that with features that encourage wildlife. So to include bird and bat boxes or bug hotels, they can all become part of the street theatre. And this brings me on to the sort of idea of street play, and public art is key to that in terms of allowing us to interact with our streets. And the thought of sort of nature play, like my initial slides looking at exploring a natural environment, these things can be introduced into a street or an urban area really simply, and they don't cost a lot. So, water features or swings and perches and mounds and logs and small incidental play spaces give you that opportunity to just explore how you interact. And you can recreate that feeling of climbing a tree or walking through a puddle and rolling down a hill in an urban setting. And it gives you that reconnection. So the sort of final piece of the puzzle, I suppose, is how we deal with water management of our urban areas and water runoff. This is an example in Sheffield, so a good news story from Sheffield called Greater Green, where an existing, I think it was an inner city dual carriageway, was effectively turned into a rain garden and bioswale, and it's the UK's largest retrofit sustainable drainage project. And by introducing planting to deal with the water issues, you're also creating habitats and also providing opportunity for introducing water into our streets. And this can be done in a variety of ways, as an element of play, or to encourage more planting in a hard urban area, and again gives us that connection. I've just put a picture on there of Building with Nature, which is a benchmark for assessing high quality green infrastructure. And the reason I mention it is because all the things I've mentioned, it ensures that by using the standards that they promote, and their themes, they cover well-being, water and wildlife, and it's a great tool for allowing us to bring nature into our cities and connecting with nature. Thank you. I'll hand over to Lauren.
Thanks, Izzy. Would you be able to pop back to Clive, please?
Yeah.
Yes. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
What I'll do, sorry, apologies. I'll just do it this way.
Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah. So
Good.
I'm just going to put that on. There we go.
We make that go full screen. Yeah. Apologies for messing up the order. I'm going to be looking at streets from a branding and wayfinding perspective. Next. To kick off with a project that we did at UE a while back, regarding a complex, compact site, and working with the client, we worked out some color-coded routes which were based on how people move through the campus. These were used across the tops of our monoliths and down the side of them for easier navigation. Next. This isn't one of ours, but it's the type of thing which has grown up now across many towns, the type of wayfinding and information points. It's very good signage. It's all very clear, shows the destination times, good maps and graphics. However, next. It strikes me we could make much more use of existing street furniture, things like litter bins and wrapped lampposts, and also look at alternative totems and monoliths for main wayfinding points. I don't think we make enough use of things that are there, but just have a pure functional feature. You could actually use it more for branding and wayfinding. Next. A lot of people look down as well as looking ahead when they're moving around a town centre. Seems to be we don't use enough of the ground, enough of the things at pavement level, and also car parks, which can be very drab, uninviting places, can really do with enlivening up and make it a little bit more joyful. That's applied to internal or external car parks. Next, the painted application that was shown previously, that's the type of thing we did for a project in Exeter, the Exeter College Technology Centre, the automotive department, where we enlivened the external walls just using a very simple method of stencils and spray paint to good effect. Next. New housing developments, street name signs obviously essential, but not very inspiring just on their own. But this is similar across lots of new developments with no real identity. Seems to me there's lots of opportunities for place branding, entrance points to developments, communal green areas or play areas. Next. And wouldn't it be more welcoming to see something like this, which shows much more, can actually depict or indicate the previous use of the site, like whether it's agricultural or it had an industrial past, or local or characteristics of the sites, maybe showing local plants and wildlife, and something given much more using natural materials to give a far better treatment. Next. We can look to internal and external sort of commercial, retail, public spaces to give that kind of look and feel. If we can do this sort of thing inside, why not outside? Next. This was a simple solution we did to a project in University of Reading, the library refurbishment. It's simply overlaid fret cut metal sheets to existing timber paneling to give a really good solution. Next. And talking in metal, there are much more interesting shapes and finishes we could achieve and see outside to give much more of a sculptural or art installation look and feel, using a bit more imagination. Next. For a student living project we did in Cardiff, this was using fret cut steel sheets. It was industrial inspired, and it had you could actually sort of see through the branding. Next. And this we applied this, of course, across the internal courtyard. So it's integrated with the landscape features. Next. And why not look at more permanent sort of uses in terms of stone masonry style, to actually look at a mix of different materials here. It would be very, very effective. Next. And looking at more a greener kind of feel, why not look at topiary, being a bit more creative with that. We're used to talking about living walls which can appear inside a building. Well, why not have something outside? And also working with the landscape to create something like using block letters, as shown here. Next. And this we used to we put to good purpose for County Hall project in Trowbridge, the refurbishment there, where internally and externally we used metallic block letters. And finally, next one. And this is for this was some project branding created for a proposed residential scheme on the edge of Paynton, which had a lot of green sustainable features to it. And it just goes to show that really with project branding can also easily turn into place branding. It can translate very, very easily. And that's where I'll wrap it up. And on to Lauren.
Great, thanks, Clive.
Yeah, I think we've lost the slides, Lauren. There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Great.
Great, thanks. So my colleagues have explored many of the components that create great streets, and I'll I'm conscious of time, so I'll very quickly turn to look at some of the tools that are available to us as built environment professionals to ensure that good street design becomes the norm rather than the celebrated exception. Next slide, please. And so where better place to start than the Planning for the Future white paper? As most of you will already know, this set out the government's step change approach to planning through widespread reform aimed at a simpler, faster and more predictable planning system. And design quality really features prominently within the white paper. The already published National Design Guide sets a very clear framework. Next slide. And building upon the principles established within the National Design Guide, a National Model Design Code is currently being prepared and probably awaited with anticipation, supposedly to be published early this year. And this will really set a process and toolkit for local authorities to progress the development of their own design codes. Next slide, please. However, the idea of design coding is certainly something that isn't new and something where the benefits have been felt for many years before. And perhaps the aspirations within the white paper will see design coding become an integral part of the planning process, and we will see the more widespread use of it coming to the fore. Next slide, please. And other entirely relevant sets of guidance that exist, the Manual for Streets is currently going through a comprehensive revision. Next slide, please. And there's numerous toolkits available to benchmark quality. Building for a Healthy Life is the latest iteration of Building for Life 12, and this has been prepared in partnership with Homes England and the NHS. Next slide. And as Izzy's already spoken about, Building with Nature benchmark is rapidly gaining momentum. But with all of these possible tools at our disposal, are we at risk of being overloaded or stifled by guidance and missing the main points of good street design? Because my colleagues have already demonstrated that we as residents, cyclists, pedestrians, drivers, parents, shoppers, business owners already know what good street design is. Next, please. And surely the focus of all street design should be on the value that it creates. The value for people, their social interactions, community spirit, sense of well-being, opportunities for play. Next. The value for wildlife as important green links through an urban environment, where nature and built form are mutually beneficial. Next. The value for places, which attract a diverse range of uses and users, with active ground floor uses that can spill out into a public realm and create vibrancy and delight. Next. And of course, the value for developers, both financially, but also in terms of reputation. Sales values may be one measure of success, but the legacy that a development can create for a developer that truly delivers its original aspirations is an equally tangible result. Next. So coming full circle, we hope that we have demonstrated today the benefits of great street design and some of the key components to creating places for all. We all already know what good street design is, so let's not wait for the policy framework to catch up. Let's just get on and do it. Thank you.
Great, thank you to all the presenters. I think that was really useful, and I'm pretty sure we've covered a lot of ground there. And I know I find it really useful to have the topic presented from several different perspectives. So I think that was really helpful. I had a feeling we might get quite a bit of feedback and questions, given that we've covered so much. So I think we're going to go ahead and make a start on those, just to make best use of our remaining 10 minutes or so. So in terms of, there's lots in here. Let's go to, there's a question from Sophie Niosh at Stantec. What experience have you of the principles of edible streets recently endorsed in the planning white paper, linking in with biodiversity and local food agendas? Has anyone got any views on that?
Hi, can you hear me? It's Isabel.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. I mean, from a landscape point of view, the introducing the sort of edible streets is it's an encouraging strategy, and it just needs thinking about in terms of stewardship, and I would say it just needs thought on sort of ownership and how and who looks after those things. So if they're managed well and are designed inclusively, and there's sort of an action group that are part of it, then it works really well. And that's where you can give ownership to the local community or the local the local kind of residents to really feel like they own, it's part of their life and an extension of their ability to, I mean, growing food, for example, is a really good way of, sustaining society in terms of allowing people to share experiences as well, and sort of tying that in with positivities for mental health, and that gardening and being outdoors is good for people's mental health. It kind of ties in with that.
Just to add to that, I think things like edible streets clearly show how the process of how we create new streets and also how we go about changing the existing streets we have is critical. If you don't have support and buy-in that comes from the community that surround it, then you just don't have the ability to actually take forward these kind of ideas. So that's where development processes are so critical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Sophie. Another one from Tom Swithenbank. Why are so many new estates being created without this sort of thinking and being car dominated and reliant? How do we stop this going forwards? Who would like to pick that one up?
I could start. Laziness.
Great.
Yeah, it's the easy go-to. It's an easy sign off with highways. And yes, I mean, I've had questions about parking before. We are in a culture at the moment of people who outside city centres depend on cars because they haven't got infrastructure facilities close to hand. So it's about a long-term goal about replanning smaller communities to make sure that facilities exist. We've got loads of benefit now from deliveries taking place, online shopping. So there's a lot of ability to create more flexibility and less demand on cars. But I'll hand over to other colleagues for their thoughts.
I can just chip in there. I think we just need to be collectively selling the vision more of what these spaces could be like without being cluttered by cars. And I think new residents buying into new developments would be sold on perhaps not having a parking space right outside their house if they were going to get something in return, which was a fantastic, beautiful space which they can sit out in, which they can use, which has got planting in. And I think if we can kind of demonstrate the advantages, then people perhaps would be less inclined to need to have a couple of parking spaces right in front of their house.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the question. We've got another one from Sam Harper at Stantec. The transition of town centres has been accelerated by COVID, and government policy is pushing for increasing density of residential in town centres. Do you think this approach will help town centres reinvent themselves as places? And what can be done in terms of design to ensure new residents in town centres feel part of a community?
I think a lot of this comes down to thinking about localized intervention. So when you're thinking about what a new street might look like in a particular area, you know, the solution for that particular street is not going to be the same in every street. And I think that's one of the key things to sort of take away from the nature of streets is that whilst they serve everybody, each one takes on a different character, and that's in part because of the physical nature of the street, the number of people, the types of communities, how well are they engaged with processes. The planning system and other and the development process can often feel like quite an alien process for those who aren't used to it. I suspect most of the people who are attending here today have had a fair bit of experience with this, and we often kind of expect local homeowners or members of the community to be as fully engaged with the system. So I think it's the onus is now more on the planning system, the development process, to ensure that it genuinely reaches out and that there is a way of understanding what is the nature of the community in this particular area, what are their needs, what do they want from it, is it a young community, is it an elderly community, is it something that's much more intergenerational, and how can we accommodate all that? And the only way we can really do that is not by second guessing, but actually by talking to those communities to understand, you know, what are the problems they're experiencing, what are their hopes, their aspirations, and then it's up to us to try and sift through that and come up with a vision that marries up with as much of their expectations as possible.
I think also in terms of a COVID recovery, I hate to say it, but there's a massive responsibility on local authorities. I know there's a lot of responsibility of lots of things on local authorities to create events, to create lots of reasons for people to come together in town centres the moment we're able to again, because that's the only way we're going to bring about activity and a reminder of how critical these spaces are for communities to come together. And so I think that's about a real kind of focus on events and community events.
Great, thank you. It's a really good question. Thank you, Sam. So Alan Swan, Stantec, has a question. What are the key lessons learnt from the past in street design? Do these design principles really work in our rural towns, or is it only for city centres?
Again, I'd go back to understanding what the locale is like. You know, what are the issues facing a particular village, a town, a city centre. I don't see that all of these interventions are for city centres. I think a lot of what Rob was showing, what Sarah was showing, what Izzy, they were showing were interventions, which some of them are just temporary. So it's finding ways of being able to easily close a street for a community event, or it's about having the infrastructure in place to allow for things to pop up or to evolve slowly. I don't think it's not about big strategic highways, corridors running through cities. I think this is very much about trying to give the opportunity to local communities to actually take more ownership of the space that's immediately adjacent to them, and that's very much about the infrastructure to allow them to take that degree of control.
For me, it's about better viability modelling and cost modelling that shows the costs that we invest at the beginning, the capital costs and the actual operational and benefit costs. So we're starting to see a shift towards that in social value measurements and testing at the moment. That's something coming about certainly in the last year and looking forward. If we can actually start to put value, financial value, to the well-being costs, health savings and benefits that we can actually get from people being able to use their streets in the public realm in a different way, then we can actually have a much better argument with what easily people will say is this is the only street I can deliver, and it's cheaper to deliver. And typically the way that standard highways have come about in new estate developments, particularly out of town, is because it's low maintenance, it's easy to manage, and it's easy to get through planning policy. So we have to use the language, which is money, to actually counterbalance that argument for longer term equations, I would say.
I would just add on the subject of rural settlements potentially needing more parking. I think we fully appreciate that they'll be probably more car dependent. I think it's what you do with the parking, and I think we're exploring on a few projects where we actually cluster homes, and we cluster the parking just outside of the cluster of homes, which still provides for that parking provision, but leaves a space which is for the residents, so it's not going to be cluttered with cars. So I think there are solutions out there which still incorporate the levels of parking that you require, but it's about where you put them.
And if I could just come in, I think a lot of it also really needs to focus on very early engagement with the local authority that you're dealing with, because only today I've been talking to a colleague about a site where there are so many different sort of competing requirements from different officers within the local authority, and it feels like highways is winning out, and really getting that early collaboration with all officers to set out the aspirations is really important.
We must also remember that there's a difference between on-street parking and off-street parking, and we need to think about the impact that on-street parking has. It's the impact that has on the quality of the street and how people can use those streets. It doesn't mean that you have to get rid of all the parking, because clearly there will always be a need for a certain degree of parking in particular areas and for different types of people. So the need will be there. So we're not saying we have to get rid of all parking. It's just thinking very carefully about the nature and the provision of that parking. Does it literally have to be a line of parking either side of the road, or is there a more sensible way of dealing with it in an off-street manner, or in a clustering approach, as Rob was saying, something that's maybe a little bit more peripheral, which means that you concentrate the cars in an area that's better able to cope with it, and then you free up other parts of our towns, villages, cities then for places for people.
Great, thank you. I am conscious of time. I know we were due to finish at 11:30, and we've kind of literally just gone past that. I'm just conscious we've got so many good questions. I think I'd like to try and sneak one more in, if that's okay. And it's for Lauren, actually. So Megan asks, Lauren, you mentioned affordability for developers, which I think is a key aspect. How can we convince today's house builders that this approach is the long-term best solution for the public well-being, rather than what is most affordable and efficient for them? Does it reside in being more strict with planning tools and design guides?
Yeah, I think it's twofold really. I think Sarah's picked up on quite a few of those points already about really having to explain this in cost terms. And there's lots of real life examples now. I included the Paintworks image, and I appreciate that is a city centre development, but it had a parking need, and the developers were really bold and the local authority were very bold in accepting a scheme which decked the buildings on, or put the buildings on top of a deck. So I think we need more, there needs to be more sort of evidence out there of where it really has added value and been successful. And then I think local authorities do have a role to play in ensuring that the policy framework is very clearly defined in terms of the expectations of development going forward.
Cool.
Because if they're embedded from the outset, a developer includes those within their cost assessment.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Lauren. That's really great. I think, yeah, as I say, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. It's a shame that, as I say, there are lots more questions in the chat and some really interesting debate as well. There seems to be quite a bit around sort of highway design standards and things like that, and maybe like the need to refresh manual for streets. And it's interesting that there's comments there from both on sort of private sector attendees, but also people from within county councils as well. So it's encouraging that there's sort of some common ground there between the views. But yeah, as I say, I think we are out of time. We are going to have to draw things to a close. I would like to sort of obviously thank, on behalf of everyone, our 6 speakers from Stride, who all did a great job, and for all of you for joining and engaging with us. It's obviously say loads of questions, which is really good. In terms of going forward, we are planning to hold further webinar events in the future as part of this series. And we're currently working to identify our next speakers. So as soon as we've got some details finalised and available to share, we will be circulating those to you. So thanks again. I hope everyone has a good rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.